Boys and girls sports. How the hell did that happen? Today we'll cover a local debate in my home state of Minnesota which highlights the stakes of fighting back against that madness. Should we roll over to comply with immoral laws, or should we defy the state to protect our daughters? Welcome to Closing Argument.
4, 3, 2. Closing Argument with Walter Hudson.
We live in crazy times, and I mean that quite literally. At no other point in human history has there ever been any confusion in any civilization regarding what a woman is. The rise of gender theory in our institutions, which is now codified in law in blue states like my own Minnesota, has muddied the waters in a way that presents danger to actual women. The area where this becomes most obvious and visible is girls' sports. Before we delve into that, let's talk briefly about your safety at home and at work. We live in a time where law enforcement has come under assault from every direction. In the Twin Cities in particular, agencies are understaffed and under-resourced, unappreciated, and unsupported. This creates a gap which needs to be filled. Fortunately, there's an option. Integris Risk Solutions is much more than your average private security company. They only employ former military and law enforcement. They have access to state-of-the-art counterintelligence, a canine unit that can detect firearms and explosives, camera monitoring, executive protection, and much, much more. And before you think that sounds too elite for you to be able to afford, give us a call. You'd be surprised how affordable on-demand security services can be, especially compared to the cost of increased insurance rates and maintenance costs. Here's a short glance at what you get with Integris.
Our agents receive extra training over, way and above the state minimum standards in order to be able to respond to any issues and be able to handle all situations.
In an uncertain world today, Integris can provide solutions to help put a little certainty back into our daily lives.
Law enforcement used to provide resource officer positions throughout a series of schools and rotate around providing security. Now they're so short-staffed that they're having a really hard time covering schools. It doesn't need to come to where we have an active shooter for them to take steps to privatize security within the school so they can fill those security gaps.
Integris Risk Solutions ownership is comprised of a combination of a former special operations sergeant, assistant fire chief, federal law enforcement officer, former Army officer. That unique combination has allowed us to provide solution to various clients.
Our agents are level-headed, they're able to de-escalate when they need to, and they know when to act and when to be still. That's the Integris difference.
We'll get into training, providing active shooter training, employee and staff training when it comes to dealing with a situation that arises, turns into a 911 call, all the way through the solution or resolution of that situation.
We believe that in Integris, we're a family. It's important who we hire and who we have working with us. If it wasn't for the agents up, that's who makes Integris.
They're not just there to be a guy with a gun or a girl with a weapon. It's to provide security and protection for the people, but also safety.
We've seen in the industry that training is where it lacks. That's the money that most people spare, is training on the employees. Our employees are our investment. And so we want to invest as much training, as quality training as we can, because a better trained employee can respond to a situation more methodically with a clear head.
Final product of that is a superior service to our client. And again, with integrity and being transparent and to our client, both to our agents and our client, that family sense and that pride in our training and bettering ourselves daily, we're providing top level quality to our clients.
We can support after-school events such as basketball, football games, proms, off-site proms. It doesn't matter what it is. And we have the ability to scale and provide the number of security staff members that are needed for each event.
And we keep getting hired back again and again and again because of our honesty and our ability to perform.
If you're a business owner, live in an HOA, administer a school district, or just need a customized security solution, Integris Risk Solutions is here for you. Contact me at Hudson at integrisrisksolutions.com or 763-445-9482 to set a no-pressure consultation. We don't want to sell you something you don't need, but we'll provide you affordable options to meet your actual needs. Again, that's Hudson at integrisrisksolutions.com or 763-445-9482. Physical competition highlights the clear biological differences between males and females. This is something that's been recognized by every civilization throughout history. In fact, in the original Olympics, and I'm talking about the ones in ancient Greece starting around 776 BC, women held their own separate games, which they called the Games of Hera. Similar female competitions occurred in ancient Egypt and Rome, often tied to religious or cultural rituals. In the 1800s, women's sports emerged as a recreational activity for ladies, such as horseback riding, swimming, archery, and tennis. By the late 1800s and early 1900s, women formed athletic clubs and began competing in team sports like basketball. The first intercollegiate game was held in 1896. The modern Olympics were revived in the same year without women, but in 1900, 22 women competed in events like golf, tennis, and sailing. Full inclusion came in 1920 and in 1922 when the first Women's Olympic Games were held in Paris, featuring track and field events like shot put and the 1,000-meter dash. At no point during any of this history did anyone even propose letting men compete with women. In fact, the distinction between men and women was so fundamental to women's sports that it required a literal act of Congress to ensure that they had equal access to opportunities. We call that act Title IX. It was enacted in 1972 and prohibited sex-based discrimination in education programs, including athletics. This dramatically increased opportunities for high school girls. Their participation in sports rose from about 300,000 in 1971 to over 3 million by the 2010s, and college women's teams expanded. Women's sports exploded. The first Women's Olympic Marathon was in 1984. The inaugural FIFA Women's World Cup was held in 1991, and the founding of the professional leagues such as the WNBA happened in 1996. All this achievement was hard-won through persistent advocacy against exclusionary opposition. But now, all that hard-won achievement has come under a new threat, the trans movement. Now, women and girls find themselves pitted against males in their sporting competitions who have an inherent physical advantage. This harms women and girls in multiple ways. First, it displaces them from athletic opportunities. If a boy makes it onto a girl's team, that's one less spot for an actual girl. If a boy prevails in competition with girls, which happens often, that's a stolen achievement that probably should have been bestowed upon a girl. Then there's the privacy issues. As Riley Gaines and others have frequently told us, you have men in women's locker rooms, often fully intact, flaunting their manhood and walking among disrobed females. It's humiliating, it's dishonoring, and it's disgusting. And then there's the physical danger. Men who compete physically with women or boys who compete physically with girls are far more likely to cause injury to their female teammates. Physical differences are routinely used to classify categories of competition. We don't put a lightweight boxer up against a heavyweight because there's an obvious advantage for the latter. So it shouldn't be remotely controversial that we also separate boys and girls in competitive sports categories. And it really isn't controversial. Polls on this issue all report majority support for keeping males out of female sports. We're talking between 60 to 80% depending on the poll. The so-called controversy is entirely contrived, pushed by a radical minority who have no actual arguments to offer. Instead, they rely upon appeals to authority and ad hominem attacks. You're somehow a science denier if you think there's a difference between men and women. Make that make sense. And of course, you're a transphobic bigot if you don't want your daughter to be disrobed in a locker room with a fully intact male. You're also a bigot if you don't want your daughter to be checked on an ice rink by a male. Your daughter should just have to sacrifice her dignity, safety, and potential for athletic achievement, all to affirm the feelings of some male who identifies as a girl. Now, all this we know. I bring it up today in order to showcase the tension that exists in a blue state like mine, Minnesota, where state law and the majority of elected leaders impose this madness upon our population. Even amongst conservatives, there are differences of opinion regarding the best way to handle this threat to our women and girls. For a specific example, I want to take you through an online exchange between two members of the Buffalo Hanover Montrose School Board in our state, each of whom have very different prescriptions for how to deal with this threat. One of them, Michael Holmstrom, just secured the Republican endorsement to run for a recently vacated state Senate seat. The other, Bob Sansevier, who is a longtime Minnesota media personality known for his work in radio, podcasting, and sports journalism, has spent more than 30 years as a member of the KQRS morning show, and previously he served as a columnist for the St. Paul Pioneer Press, covering topics like local sports teams, including the Minnesota Wild and the Vikings. He currently hosts The BS Show, a daily podcast focused on sports, news, and interviews, where I myself have been a guest multiple times, and which broadcasts on radio stations in Duluth, Hibbing, and St. Cloud. He's also the proud father of Samantha Sansevier, another friend of mine who formerly produced the morning show on Twin Cities News Talk KTLK AM 1130, where I myself had an evening radio program for 3 years. So these two men, Holmstrom and Sansevier, are both friends of mine who I deeply respect. But the conflict between them is worth exploring to discern how we should properly fight back against gender theory madness. Holmstrom and Sansevier sit on opposite sides of the issue, not necessarily philosophically, but certainly practically. Holmstrom was elected to the BHM school board largely on the platform of pushing back against the district's current policy of abiding by state mandates to allow boys to compete in girls' sports. Sansevier, on the other hand, has served on the school board for significantly longer and takes a more pragmatic approach, deferring to pressures of state law and the threat of lawsuits in order to, in his mind, protect the district from financial liability. Now, I think both men have a point. But as we analyze the latest public dispute between them, I am going to take a side, and I'll clearly articulate my reasons for doing so. The spat began with an ex-post from Dustin Grady, another friend of mine who catapulted to significant influencer status during his media work in the 2024 presidential campaign. In full disclosure, Grady is a close personal friend of Holmstrom and a top volunteer on his campaign for state senate. Grady posted a screenshot of a Facebook post from Bob Sansevier where Bob said this: "Due to an agreement they all may regret, 3 of the other Republicans who sought the seat dropped out of the Republican August 26th primary. Their agreement was to honor the results from Tuesday night's convention, which I was told was stacked with Holmstrom delegates and cronies. He still can be beaten in the primary by a Republican who entered the race yesterday named Bradley Kurtz, a military veteran and small business owner who I will have as a guest Friday morning on the BS show. Know this. In the primary, anyone, Republican or Democrat, can vote for Kurtz to stop Holmstrom. I have had encounters with Holmstrom, and he comes off as desperate to get elected to something to validate he isn't the man-child many believe him to be." Well then, obviously we're off to a great start in terms of having a civil conversation about the issue. Now listen, I understand Bob's frustration to an extent, but I'll come back to that later. Grady's post had this commentary in response to that. He said, "Buffalo Hanover Montrose School Board Chair Bob Sansevier is still bitter that Michael Holmstrom stood up to protect our daughters from boys and girls sports and locker rooms. Now he's begging Democrats to vote in a Republican primary against a conservative fighter." That sets the tone for the back and forth to follow. Now, all of this is taking place within the context of a contested primary for a crucial state Senate seat, so we should take everything said with a grain of salt. But you get a good sense of the tension from these initial posts. Grady follows up with this: "Notice how Bob refuses to acknowledge federal law and the Moms for Liberty lawsuit that names BHM schools in the legal injunction. The school district has the right, by the authority of the courts, to reverse the policy until it is heard by the Supreme Court. As a parent of BHM schools, I'm disappointed by this answer, to say the least. So what's Greggy referring to? Well, there was a lawsuit from Moms for Liberty, which included the Buffalo, Hanover, Montrose School District, resulting in a court injunction which potentially allows the school board to reverse its policy on boys' participation in girls' sports. Now, this undermines Sansevier's claim that state law constrains the district from defending girls. President Trump has issued an executive order called the Keeping Men Out of Women's Sports Act, which introduces federal legislation under Title IX. That conflicts with Minnesota's state mandate and shifts the legal burden onto schools like BHM to align with federal directives or risk losing federal funding. So what's the school district to do? Well, it's a catch-22. On the one hand, they risk the ire of state authorities, entirely controlled by Democrats, if they stand up for the rights of girls to maintain their privacy, dignity, and fair competition. On the other hand, they risk the ire of the feds if they fail to comply with Trump's directive. Now, I have a unique perspective on this situation, because before serving as a state representative in Minnesota, I spent 7 years on the city council in Albertville, Minnesota. That tenure included the pandemic. During that time, Governor Tim Walz seized unilateral power under a flawed reading of state statute to force businesses to close, to keep kids out of school, to close churches, and even set up a snitch line for neighbors to tattle on each other for having too many guests over for Thanksgiving. I, along with what I maintain was a majority of Minnesotans, was absolutely furious with this abuse of power. And so I brought a resolution before the Albertville City Council, which would have declared our city's intent to not cooperate. The resolution condemned Walz's power grab and declared that no city resources would be used to enforce his unconstitutional mandates upon Albertville residents. You could say I was the Michael Holmstrom of the Albertville City Council. I was pushing for a bold stance against objective tyranny in spite of potential legal and financial liability. As it turned out, I wasn't able to get a second for my resolution, as the rest of the council abided by the advice that they got from our city attorney and other city staff, who warned that the resolution was largely symbolic and risked provoking retaliation from the governor when it came to things like bonding projects and other forms of state funding. My stance was, let him do it. Let the governor show us who he is. Let Walz deny essential funding to our city as retaliation for standing up for the rights of our residents. Reveal his character. But that argument ultimately didn't prevail. Now, I share this not to demean or disparage my colleagues on the council or to suggest that they were complicit in Walz's tyrannical overreach. They weren't. They responded rationally on the advice of staff to protect the financial interests of the city. They weren't bad people for doing so. But I was coming from a different perspective. To me, there are times when you fight, no matter the potential cost, because the cause is just. If you aren't willing to risk your life, treasure, and sacred honor for liberty, then you don't really get to complain when it's taken away from you. Similarly, the situation in Buffalo, Hanover, Montrose School District presents a scenario where, from a certain point of view, it makes sense to comply with state mandates. School districts in Minnesota are under tremendous financial pressure, and any legal battle could potentially end up costing them teachers and other resources necessary to teach their kids. Municipal staff, like attorneys and administrators, are tasked with advising elected boards to do the safest thing. That's their job. They're supposed to advise you of the safest course of action in order to protect the interests of the institution. When my city attorney advised the other members of the Albertville City Council to vote against my resolution, he was acting appropriately in his role to protect the city from liability and consequence. He gave the advice that he probably should have given. But here's the thing. There's a reason why we elect people to make policy decisions rather than just hire staff to administrate everything. The reason we elect people is so they can take into account the larger context, especially the political context, in order to make decisions that align with the will of the people who elected them. In the case of boys and girls sports, again, we're talking about an 80-20 issue. The overwhelming majority of people want to protect girls from the indignity and danger of competing against boys. So the question becomes, when is it time to set caution aside and take the bold, if dangerous, stance? When is it time to risk something in order to effect good? And I would argue that protecting girls from the predations and hazards of boys competing against them and entering their private spaces more than meets that standard. Now, I don't fault my friend Bob Sansevier for prioritizing fiscal responsibility and legal liability. That's a rational choice, just like handing over your wallet when a mugger has you at gunpoint is a rational choice. It's not immoral to concede to a demand under duress. But I'm very glad that my other friend, Michael Holmstrom, is likely to be the next state senator from Minnesota due to his willingness to fight back against that mugger. I mean, it's risky either way. And I'm not sure there's a right answer, but I know which choice I would make because I've made it before. That's it for today. For X subscribers, YouTube channel members, and audio podcast subscribers, be sure to check out my supporter-exclusive bonus show, The Smoke-Filled Room, where I get more personal and cover a broader range of topics. YouTube members also get early access to new videos. Join now for immediate access. Take care.